This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horror, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter. This week, we're talking with author and editor Demi Michelle Schwartz. Demi Michelle Schwartz is an author from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She writes novels and short stories in various genres and age categories. Demi runs Amethyst Ink Editorial, where she focuses on developmental and line editing for novels, novellas, and short stories. She's also a publicist at Wild Ink Publishing, and she hosts Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. When Demi isn't working on her manuscripts, she's chasing her other dream as an award-winning songwriter and recording artist. Demi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Icebreaker question. Are you planning another Heart of Indie Radio Halloween special?
So we do those annually, so yes, there will be another one. I love doing that. I've hosted that or co-hosted and produced it for a couple years now, and it's always so much fun. So there will be another one this year.
You wear many hats, as indicated by the intro. Can you give us a little rundown and maybe some tips that you have for writers that you've gleaned from your work in editing?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I first became an editor because I got an MFA from Seton Hall University. And when I was in that program, I did a lot of critiquing and worked with mentors. And so I really gained insight into what it's like to work with other authors and edit. And I really developed a passion for that then. One of the biggest takeaways I've had just from being an editor, like professionally now, is that it's so important for authors, I think, to have a vision for their story before seeking editorial help from beta readers, critique partners, or a professional editor. It's easier as editors to kind of get in deep and see what the author intended to do when the author kind of already has an idea, because you'll often hear in publishing how it's really subjective and people have different editorial visions. And sometimes it can be difficult to see an editorial vision if you can't really see what the author was trying to do. And once you're able to see what an author is trying to do, it's easier to kind of see what they were going for and help them to realize that vision. And so this goes back to like self-editing. Like I may be an editor, but before I send books to my agent, I always send it to friends, and I have an editor too. And before I even get to the stage of sending my work to others, I do a lot of self-editing myself to really dig deep on like, who's my character? What is their goal? What is this main plot arc? What's the main conflict? And like, if you know that as the author and you portray that in the best way you can, then you're going to be able to get the help you need. But I think first it's important as the author to know like, what are you trying to say, or what is your intent with the story itself?
To make strong choice for every element of the story.
Right, exactly. I think sometimes too, when you look at scene to scene to scene, one of the biggest things that I see in terms of like pacing issues is sometimes we'll see scenes that things are happening, but they're not contributing to the main arc. And it's really hard to tell, like, what is this scene's purpose? Yes, the character is moving around and doing things and talking to people, but in terms of the greater story arc, what does the scene contribute? And sometimes it doesn't. So I think it's really important for authors to kind of look at their book in chunks of scenes and ask yourself, what purpose is each scene serving, and make sure that that purpose is clear.
All right, time to switch hats. Tell us about your work as a publicist.
Yeah, so that's so fun. So long story short, one of my friends who's an agent, who has a connection with Wild Ink Publishing too, she actually connected me with Abigail Wild, who's the publisher. And last spring, she offered me a publicity intern position. And now I'm actually a publicist for them. And it's been a lot of fun. I think the coolest thing is working with other authors and seeing their excitement when they get an interview or a review or some kind of feature or a book signing or something like that. And as an independent artist, I do all of my PR and my marketing myself. I'm not with a label. I don't have a manager. And so like I have a lot of experience myself with my own music. And so transitioning into doing that for other authors and publishing has been really cool. And it's also been nice too to kind of build my network in that area, because down the road that could be beneficial for me, like the podcast and the different reviewers and different bookstores. So it's been really fun to build that side of my network and also to see the author's excitement when they get opportunities.
What advice would you give to writers who are looking for a publicist?
I think the biggest thing is if you're not like, so say you're self-publishing and you want to hire a publicist, I think before getting into any kind of business relationship, I think it's really important to think about the trust factor and make sure that you're working with someone who is one, going to do their job. Number two, isn't going to hurt you in any way. Because I think as somebody who hosts two podcasts, and I'm sure you can probably speak on this too, sometimes we get emails when it's like they're not professional at all. And it's not the artist's fault or it's not the author's fault because they have no idea what kinds of emails the publicist is sending out. And so professionalism really goes a long way. And so before like working with any kind of publicist, it's good to look at the authors they've worked with, maybe see if you can get references and see like other authors' experiences working with them, and just make sure that you're getting into a good business relationship.
Switch hats. You have two podcasts. What advice would you give to someone looking to start a podcast? And follow up, what have you learned from having discussions about the publishing industry?
Yeah, so in terms of starting a podcast, first I would like to say that there's always room for more. I'm always looking for new podcasts to listen to. So one of the things I would say is if you're interested in starting a podcast, to really think about the approach you want to take. Like yours is very clear. Like this is a horror podcast for horror fans, Halloween fans. Mine is a little different in the fact that I cover various spots of the industry. I talk to agents and authors and editors, and each chapter of the show is focused on some kind of topic connected to being a writer or publishing. And so I think it's really important to think about what is your target audience? What kind of guests do you want to have on? Do you just want to talk to debut authors? Do you just want to talk to fantasy authors? Do you just want to talk to agents? So think about like what exactly you want to focus on. And then the other thing I would say is think about your style. All podcasts are different. Some are very strict interview styles, some are more conversational, and they all have different structures. So give some thought into how you want to structure your show, because consistency is really important when listeners tune into each episode. There should be some kind of consistent quality to that. And in terms of like what I've learned from the conversations on the show, I think that's one of the most special things about hosting a podcast and doing so in both music and publishing is I learned so much from the guests, and it's really made me a more empathetic person. It's really opened my mind to different people's experiences. I've learned more about different aspects of the industry just from talking to others. Like I just had a conversation with a former editorial assistant at Big Five publishing houses, and she talked all about the acquisitions process. And being currently on submission right now, like that's a little it's a little blurry for me. Like I don't know all that goes on behind the scenes of like when an editorial assistant or acquisitions editor gets a manuscript to when it actually gets an offer, when it goes through the whole acquisitions team and all that. And so it's really insightful for me to learn. So it's just really interesting when I learn things, and it's also really special to be able to give people a platform, because I've gotten so many messages from authors who were on or songwriters I had on my other one, and they said that's the first time that they were on a podcast, and it's really cool to give that first to people.
That leads me to your next hat. You are an intern at a literary agency.
Yep.
What information or insights have you gleaned from that experience?
So far, I've been doing several things. I'm helping with preparing materials for authors going on submission. I'm currently reviewing thriller queries right now. I'm also evaluating client manuscripts and researching editors to build sublists. So I've been doing a lot. And trying to think of like something to highlight. I guess just because I'm like actively reading queries right now, as somebody who has been in that querying stage, I would just like to emphasize the importance of following submission guidelines and also knowing what is standard. So like if you send a query without comparable titles, that's going to be a red flag. If you send more pages than what you're asked to send, that's going to raise a red flag. And as somebody, like I completely understand how the agents feel now, Because if you get like so many submissions and you're reading through, if like things are off, then it kind of makes you go, like, I'm not sure like if they're fully aware of like what's expected in the industry and stuff like that. And so I would just say like really like look at what you're asked to send and try to send that to your best of your ability. And the other thing is with like opening pages, to really grab someone's attention. Voice is really important. I know that's something that people talk about a lot and it's more abstract and hard to pin down, but that's something that you can develop through revisions and getting feedback from critique partners and beta readers. Because again, if it takes till page 10 for the voice to really kick in or for the hook to really grab you, an agent might not read that much. So I think just putting your best foot forward in terms of the query letter and then also the pages. But it's really interesting too, because the agent I'm assisting, like we have some overlapping opinions, but there's some submissions where I'm like, oh my goodness, like I would definitely like rep that if I was an agent. And she was like, oh, that's not for me. And so it's just really driving home the point as well from the other side that it is really subjective. And I know authors hate to hear that, like being an author myself, when I get like that from editors on submission, like, oh, it's not a fit. It's like, but why not? But like actually experiencing that like firsthand, working with an agent and us having various like different opinions, it's really interesting to see how like it literally is subjective a lot of the times, and it's not necessarily anything wrong with the story.
Last hat. You are a musician and songwriter.
Yeah.
How does your musicality or your lyricism impact your writing and vice versa?
I love this question. I get it often. I think it's really interesting because they are very similar to me. The main difference I would say is with writing, I'm writing fiction. With songwriting, all of my songs are autobiographical, and so they're based on my life, and so it's not fiction. But in terms of like the songwriting and the writing itself, we use the same things. Like if you have a 3-minute song or a 300-page novel, you have a character of sorts. Like I'm the character in the song and you got the character in the story. There's themes woven throughout, metaphorical, like literary devices, metaphors, similes, that kind of thing. Story driven, like my songs are very story driven, so they tend to have like a beginning, middle, and end, like you would find in a story. And it's just really great for me too, because I often like switch between them. Like, so for example, if I'm like really stressed out with publishing, like I'll write my music. And if I'm like in the midst of a heavy release cycle and I'm not actively writing any music, I turn more to their novel writing or short stories. And so it's nice for me to shift between them because they allow me to tap into my creativity in different ways. And that just helps me overall to continue staying inspired and creating, whether that's music or fiction.
Okay, well, let's get into some fiction. So you sent me a handful of short stories, and the first one we're going to dive into is The Garden of Terrors. Can you give us a little bit of background on this one?
Yeah, so this one is published in an anthology called Infernal Delights by Dragonstone Press. And this one was a lot of fun to write. The idea came from imagining what it would be like if you actually lived a nightmare, because we hear that phrase a lot when people say like, oh, I'm living a nightmare, but like what would it be like if that was taken literally? And I explore that in this YA horror short story. The characters Briar and Poppy go to the Garden of Terrors, and they describe it as being one of the 7 horror wonders of the ancient world, if that existed. And basically once you go into the garden, you're transported to what they describe as the garden's afterlife, and they meet a ghost who basically gives them a deadline. If they don't escape the nightmare in time, they'll stay trapped in there forever and die. And so there's a ticking clock aspect. There's a bunch of different obstacles they face tied to different kind of nightmarish things. Not going to give them away, but that was a lot of fun to write and just to explore the idea of literally living a nightmare, what that could look like.
I like the idea of there being 7 horror wonders of the ancient world.
That had to be a thing.
Do you have any other horrors on deck?
Man. What, like for the 7 wonders?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think it'd be really fun now that I'm thinking about it to like write 6 more like this and maybe put them in a collection and call it the 7 horror wonders of the ancient world.
What is your approach to the YA age range when it comes to horror?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because I'm a YA author and I write some middle grade and some new adult, but most of mine are YA. And I think it's interesting because with YA fiction in general, that's an age category where emotions run so high. Like, I just cringe thinking about my teenage years because it's like I was so dramatic and everything was life or death or whatever. And it's interesting when you look at horror because horror with emotion, like emotion is at the root of horror with the fear and the dread, but just emotion in general. And so I think like whenever I'm writing YA horror short stories, it's very like immediate. I tend to write in first person present. And so it's very immersive and like everything to that character is like a life or death situation where in horror that's typically their reality. And so really leaning into the emotion especially and thinking about that character and how they're experiencing these horrifying situations, I think that's going to really set apart. Not saying like, middle grade and adult, they definitely have the emotion too, but why that audience and that age range in general, like everything is so like the emotions are so extreme and you can really bring that out, especially in your protagonist's interiority.
Was this in a charity anthology?
Yes, that one was. Yeah, it was for hurricane relief from Helene and Milton. So we were raising money to give to organizations supporting that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Another story you sent was Revenge at Ravenwood. Tell us about this one.
This was my first horror short story I wrote, and this one's published in an anthology called Gore for Demons by Po' Boy Publishing. And this is a YA gothic horror. And this one, it's very loosely a reimagining of The Raven by Poe. And this was really fun to write. So in this one, Reverie, he's the protagonist, and her boyfriend Silas go to the Ravenwood Library of Gothic Literature, which is in the middle of a forest. And a girl died in this library years ago, and Reverie's boyfriend Silas has always been fascinated by the supernatural and things like that. And so he convinced her to go on Devil's Eve, which is not the best of ideas. And once they go into the library, they get locked inside, the candles light themselves, and they start to smell this very strong rosy smell. And Reverie finds a bracelet with an R charm on it. And the girl who died, her name started with the letter R too. And she was like compelled to put this bracelet on. And given the anthology has demonic possession as a theme, you could probably think about where this would go. But it was really fun because you'll find out that Reverie actually had a tie to the girl who died loosely, and it's not the best of happy endings. So that's a little bit about that one.
I know you write fantasy and romantasy. Is it kind of nice to not have a happy ending?
Yeah, and that's really funny too because typically I gravitate toward darker stuff. Like even my fantasies can go a little dark, and I write thriller too, which is in the same kind of space as like horror mystery, like the darker fiction. I've always loved that. And the thing with horror is not going to spoil the end of Revenge at Ravenwood, but it actually had a different ending. And I got feedback from a friend who wrote a YA gothic horror novel that I read. And she's like amazing. And I was like, I need some advice because this was my first time actually writing in that genre. And she's like, to me, like, your ending's a little too like sunshine and butterflies. Let's make it darker. And so ever since that, it's like I've been more mindful of the endings. Sometimes with horror, like they could be very dark endings or just leaving the door open for things being unsettling. And so I've been really mindful of my endings to not really put a pretty bow on them and kind of leave them more edgy.
I think that applies to your next story, Rosalia. What's this one about?
I love Rosalia. This one I'm very close to turning into a novel and using the story as like a prequel. This one is in an anthology called Horrific Tales Volume 1 Hauntings by Horrific Productions. And this one was so fun to write. So basically what this one is, it follows a songwriter named Leah, and she's on break from school and she goes into the Rocky Mountains in Colorado for a solo songwriting retreat at a secluded cabin. And when she arrives at the cabin, it's really sketchy. Like she thinks she hears someone whispering her name, and then she goes in and the lights aren't working, and she's like very like not the best of situations. And then out of nowhere, an obituary flutters to the ground. And when she looks at it, it's an obituary for a girl named Rosa, who was a songwriter as well. And Leah gets very unsettled because looking at the picture of Rosa, it's like she knows her, but Rosa died decades before. And so she's like, there's no way I could have met her or knew her. And then she turns around and she sees Rosa's reflection in the window and gets very creeped out, as you would imagine. And then from there, it gets really twisted. It's a speculative thriller. It plays with obviously supernatural elements. And yeah, that was really fun to write. And I have these plans for a novel that I would like to do. So we'll see what happens. But this one is definitely up there as one of my favorites.
Do you ever go on these solo retreats for songwriting?
No, I've never gone on a solo one like this. I don't think I would. I'm too scared to go by myself like that. But I did actually go to Nashville for a songwriting retreat a couple years ago. There were other songwriters, so I wasn't by myself, but that was really fun.
Nice. So, staying with the spooky theme, I'm going to ask you for a Halloween treat. Can you recommend a book, movie, game, food, or experience, past or present, that puts you in the Halloween mood?
I'm gonna have to go with book, and if people haven't read this, you have to read it. It's called um, Rules for Vanishing. It's a YA horror by Kate Alice Marshall, and it is so good. I read this when I was in my MFA program for a class, and I remember it was like late one night, and I was like, "Oh, I'll start reading it, and then I'll go to bed." And then I was up all night because I was so freaked out and I couldn't put this thing down. It's basically about this girl whose sister went missing down this road that, if I'm remembering correctly, it only appears at the same time once every year. And there was like a ghost at the end of the road. And it's supposed to be like this myth or lore of the town. I haven't read it in a bit, so I hope I'm remembering correctly. But she and her friends go to the spot because they were like, no, this road doesn't exist. And then it appears and they go down the road and it's the most unsettling, like the stuff that happens. And like this is one of the horror stories I love. Like I'm not a huge fan of like the super gory stuff necessarily. I'm more a fan of like supernatural stuff, of just like really unsettling, like quiet horror, like some monsters. But this book, like I was so entranced by it. And it was also really cool too because like in Carrie how they have like the other accounts where they'll have like interviews with people or like news articles about like telekinesis or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I was like sprinkle. So it's similar to that. Like you have like little bits and pieces of like accounts of like what happened. And it's so cool. It's like it has that multimedia element. It's so good. It's so good.
Excellent. My Halloween treat for this episode is that when my wife and I were putting together our wedding registry, I saw some really fancy pumpkin carving knives, and they were orange blades with orange covers and orange handles, which is a little dangerous actually when you're trying to keep your fingers intact and you're pushing it into an orange pumpkin. But they're really good knives, and we still have them years later. So I recommend that everyone go out and get yourself a really nice pumpkin carving knife.
I love it.
Demi, what projects are you working on next?
Currently I am working on a new quiet horror short story that I'm going to be submitting to an anthology. And I'm in the middle of some manuscripts at the moment for my books. I have one thriller out with a friend who's an editor and one thriller with my agent. So I'm just waiting on feedback right now. So I'm writing a lot of short stories. And the next three, I believe, are for horror anthologies. And it's so cool. I think, ever since I started really diving into the world of anthologies, horror is like where it's at. Like there's so many, and the majority that I'm seeing pop up are like horror ones. So just like for anyone listening, like if you're interested in submitting short stories, or if you're like me and you haven't really done a lot of horror writing on your own, you can definitely start getting into it with short stories, because that's what I did. Like Revenge at Ravenwood was my first one, and now every time I see a call for horror, I'm like all over it because it's so fun.
And where can our listeners find you online?
You can find me through my website, which is demimschwartz.com. And on there, you'll find everything about me as an author, songwriter, my podcast, my editing business, and everything else. If you want to connect with me on social, I'm most active on Twitter. My handle is at Demi Schwartz, and my display name is Demi Michelle with the butterfly emoji. And it's the same on Instagram, Demi Schwartz, and then the Demi Michelle with the butterfly emoji is my display name.
Demi, thank you for hanging out with us and showing us all of your various hats.
Yes, I know. It's sometimes it's like I get asked how I do it, and I just say that I have a secret twin and I live 5 lives.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and follow. We're now on YouTube. Links are in the show notes. You could find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.